Assalamualaikum.
Assalamualaikum.
Walaikum assalam. How are you, Dr. Anjum?
Alhamdulillah.
Alhamdulillah, that's great. Thanks for getting on. I'm just letting Ubaydullah know you are on. He should be getting on in just a minute, inshallah.
Okay. While I'm on, I'll just signal me.
Yes.
I'll just turn off the.
Sure. Okay. Sure. He should be on soon. Thank you.
Mhm.
Assalamualaikum. Ovamir, Ustadh Ubaydullah is joining right now. Ubaydullah, are you on?
Yes, I'm on.
Okay, Assalamualaikum.
Alaikum salam. I'm going to plug in my ultra good Oh, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
We can't.
And
Oh, okay.
how's
We
how?
can't see you yet. Okay.
And there I am.
Sound like
Wow, that's a Waikum Sam. That's a lot of noise.
yeah.
Let me close. Let me close the windows in my office. Hold on.
Okay. Sound like
You know, with these sound cancellation headphones, it makes my voice very clear, but you can hear like everything. You can hear like a pin drop.
yeah, it is really clear. Is is this new? Did you get this yourself?
My wife bought these for my birthday.
Oh, okay. Okay, nice.
Alhamdulillah.
Yeah.
So the voice is very clear, but the bad thing is the ambient sound. If
Oh,
somebody like if I do this, you can hear it.
yeah. What is that called? The ASMR?
Yeah. These are like studio quality headphones.
Yeah.
This is like the real deal stuff.
Yeah. Nice and clear. All
Yep.
right. It's past 8 o'clock, so we can get started. Go ahead, Dr. Anjum is on as well, so I'll mute myself.
Ovamir, salam alaikum.
عليكم السلام ورحمة الله وبركاته حبيبي.
Alhamdulillah. How are you?
Your
Your face is cut off. I don't see. There you go. Lower your camera just. Yeah, I can see you, but just lower your camera just a little bit.
Okay.
Ah, perfect. Well, neither did I a couple weeks ago. You know, a month ago or so. Mashallah. So, Shireen, should we get started?
Yeah, you can go ahead and get started.
Okay, we're already live?
Yeah, we are.
Oh wow, I wouldn't have been clowning around like that. Okay, let me get serious. I am Ubaydullah. No. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونستهديه ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا فمن يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله ثم أما بعد السلام عليكم. I am honored and I feel extremely privileged to be with everyone who's tuning in this evening. This is the What's Going On session, or so this is a virtual hangout. And what we've been doing over the course of the last, few weeks or so is inviting different scholars on, and we usually engage in a completely unscripted conversation. These conversations have tended to be very wide-ranging, but also very free-flowing. So people are not giving pre-packaged, canned responses. And of course, that does require a greater measure of trust. I remind you that the Prophet, peace be upon him, he said, "Al-majalisu bil-amana," that all sittings, all gatherings are conducted or convened with an implicit trust, so that not only do we refrain from divulging anything that might be sensitive information, we also intentionally put the best construction on anything that might be shared amongst us, amongst ourselves, this evening. Tonight, I have the great privilege and the great, honor of being on with someone that, I esteem a great deal, but also feel very close to as a brother and a friend, Dr. Ovamir Anjum, who is currently teaching at the University of Toledo, if I'm not mistaken, correct? And just concluded a translation of Ibn al-Qayyim al-Jawziyya's Madarij al-Salikin. Am I correct?
First two of 4 volumes, yes.
MashaAllah. So if you would, man, tell us, why that, first off, I want to know, there's always something of a debate among contemporary Islamic thinkers. Should we be producing original works or should we be producing high quality translations? You seem to have answered that question with this word. Why? Why a translation? Why not an original work?
Okay, very good. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, alhamdulillah. As-salatu was-salam ala Rasulillah. First of all, it's also a great honor and pleasure for me to be with my brother, Ubaydullah. We met a long time ago, and I remember several years ago, we spent some evenings together in Chicago in Hyde Park.
Yes.
And then off and on since.
Yes.
And mashallah, it's been a pleasure to know, like Ubaydullah, coming into and teaching people with a diverse set of skills. He could have done many things, and he does many other things with his intelligence and, mashallah, with his looks. And
No way.
You don't know his sense of fashion. He could have done quite well on the West Coast.
Well, I'm stuck in the Midwest.
Yes, so he chose the field of da'wah, and I think that's a sign of a growing community and a sign of a more maturing and rich community, that we have du'at and ulama from the various backgrounds. And one of the things that I find in my historical studies is the ulama in the times and periods in societies where the ulama are more diverse, they come from upper class, lower class, middle class, different background, different ethnicities. That is when you get a real good sort of role for the ulama in the society as mediators between people and leaders of people, socio-religious leaders of people. And that is some of the best scenarios that you get in Muslim in Islamic history, and where you have ulama only come from the chosen ethnicities or chosen languages and chosen linguistic backgrounds and chosen classes. That is when ilm gets corrupted and the perception of Islam among people becomes limited and corrupted, because then people become invested in various class interests and so on. So alhamdulillah, there are many reasons why I love my brother Ustadh Ubaydullah. So the question about why Madarij al-Salikin, why translate such a work? First of all, Madarij al-Salikin في منازل إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين. It is a work that's written in 14th century of the Gregorian calendar, that is the 8th century of the Hijri calendar, by Imam al-Allama Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyya, who wrote a commentary on, or wrote it as a commentary on, a critical commentary on an earlier Sufi work, Manazil al-Sa'irin, by a major Sufi scholar and a Hanbali and a Mufassir from Afghanistan, from the place in Afghanistan called Herat. So his name is Abu Ismail al-Harawi al-Ansari, because his nisbah goes to the Ansar of Rasulullah in Medina. So Abu Ismail al-Harawi al-Ansari wrote a book called Manazil al-Sa'irin, which 2 centuries earlier, he was a contemporary of Imam al-Ghazali, rahimahullah, and his original book, Manazil al-Sa'irin, was the go-to manual for the Sufis of the time. By the way, if you know this part of history, Imam al-Ghazali was not a well-known Sufi. In fact, he was sort of an outsider writing about Sufis. The real Sufi master of the time was Abu Ismail al-Harawi al-Ansari, who wrote this book, whose book, Manazil al-Sa'irin, would be used by the Sufi initiates as a mnemonic device. They would memorize it. And as they memorized and they would enter different stations, they would compare their ahwal, their inner states, with the description and the warnings and the aspirations provided by Shaykh al-Islam, Ismail al-Hansari. Shaykh al-Islam is also one of the titles given to Ismail al-Harawi al-Ansari.
Now, oh, wait a minute, I want to stop you. I mean, this is a beautiful kind of condensed historical survey, but you do realize that within our community, the term Sufism is a charged, I mean, some people, maybe they were about to cut off their devices as soon as you said Sufi or Sufism without censoring those terms. Now, I know you to be someone that is unapologetic about critiquing, certain expressions and exponents of Sufism. So you have certainly shown yourself to be fair and objective. So I think you would be a good person, to answer the question, what do you mean when you say Sufi, Sufism? What do you mean by such terms?
So Sufism, tasawwuf, I mean, Sufism is a term in English, obviously it's a translation, but when you use the word ism, that's a modern sort of construction. It is how Orientalists translated certain mystical works that they found in the Islamic tradition. But tasawwuf and the word Sufi is part of a universe, part of an, if you will, an ecology of terms in the Islamic societies that emerged to refer to what we may today call Islamic psychology, zuhud or asceticism, and then more philosophical mysticism, all of these various things, which were always often at odds with each other. In other words, they're not one thing. And they all get called Sufism. And part of the difficulty with the English language and the fact that much of our tradition is excavated through an outsider's perspective is that we can't understand our own tradition without doing a little bit of this excavation, a little bit of this genealogy of what these things mean. Many of the people who were valorized as the great shuyukh by the Sufi masters, by people who call themselves Sufis, these people, for example, Abdurrahman al-Sulami, who wrote a famous book called Tabaqat al-Sufiyya, which is one of the earlier books written early 4th century, one of the earliest books that sort of consolidated a history or a group that it called Sufis. Now, many of the people named in that book would not call themselves Sufis. For example, Abu Talib al-Makki, of an earlier figure, an earlier century, who in fact uses the term Sufi only critically. But later, of course, they all get categorized as Sufi. So that's a little bit of a sort of caution, because when I'm going to define the term Sufi, I'm going to define a very general phenomenon. And one thing, and the other sort of disclaimer is that Sufism, then, as understood in Islamic history, emerged as in the 3rd century of Islam, that is in the 9th century of the Gregorian calendar. I'm just going to stick to Hijris when I'm talking about early century. So 3rd century of Islam, among certain circles of scholars, by the way, among the Hanbalis. So they were not Hanbalis necessarily, but they were among the Ahl al-Hadith and the followers of Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, and the Sufis were usually, they mixed in the same circles in Baghdad in 3rd century. And Al-Junayd is, of course, one major figure, Abu Muhammad Al-Junayd, rahimahullah, who died in the year 298. You could say that's the first generation of people who identified themselves as Sufi, and they understood tasawwuf as an intellectual discourse. In an earlier century, that is in the 2nd century, Sufism Sufi, the term Sufi existed, but it was applied to people running around doing Amr al-Ma'ruf and Nahy al-Munkar on the streets and wearing woolen shirts.
Okay, when you say al-amr bil-ma'ruf, when you say al-amr bil-ma'ruf and nahy al-munkar, you mean enjoining the good, forbidding the evil. We have to remember that we have some listeners that don't speak Arabic. So try to translate your terms if you can remember.
Right, of course I will. So in other words, in the 2nd century, the time of Imam al-Shafi'i and Imam Malik, the authentic narrations we have from them show that they did not know much about what this new group of people, Sufis, are. So Imam Malik, for example, when somebody told him that there are some people who drink a certain liquid and then dance all night. And they said, are these people children? So Imam Malik is genuinely surprised at this behavior. He said, are they children? And his disciples said, no, they're not children. He said, they're crazy. No, they're not crazy. He said, so Imam Malik said, we have not heard any such behavior from Ahl al-Islam. That's all his comment. In other words, Imam Malik doesn't know anything about them. He hears about them in 3rd person, and he says, we don't know these people. What is going on? Now, we don't know. There's not much doctrinal content at this time. These are simply a practice of separating yourself from the upper classes and from the more luxurious classes by showing that you're wearing wool, and wearing a wool shirt was a sign of being on the street, being somebody who doesn't enjoy luxuries of life. In the 3rd century, with the circle of Imam al-Junayd in Baghdad, remember Baghdad is the center, the metropolis of the Islamic world, and it is here that you have this spiritual, psychological discourses that focus on inner states being organized in a way that they were not organized before. And these people call themselves Sufis. And there are other traditions outside of Baghdad, in Khuzan, in Iraq, in Basra, that do not call themselves Sufis, right? But they later get incorporated as Sufis. So Abu Talib al-Makki is somebody who would be closer to the Malamatiyya, but later he gets called Sufi. So you could say, in short, that Sufism, historically speaking, was the Baghdadi version of the spiritualist movements in early Islam.
Okay, now, something of a conundrum that might be forming in some of the minds of our attendees. You said that the original book was written by Shaykh al-Islam, Shaykh Harawi, and then Madarij al-Salikin, the book that you translated 2 volumes of, was a work by Ibn al-Qayyim al-Jawziyah, kind of a ta'alif or a commentary on Shaykh al-Harawi's book. I thought, just very simple, kind of basic reasoning, I thought that Ibn Taymiyya and Ibn al-Qayyim al-Jawziyah, his prized pupil, I thought they were arch anti-Sufis. So why would Ibn al-Qayyim al-Jawziyah have interest in offering commentary on a book by a well-known Sufi master?
Yeah, so subhanAllah, this is a quite widespread misunderstanding, but it has no grounding in actual fact. Now, Shaykh al-Islam ibn Taymiyya was titled Shaykh al-Islam, and he was directly a teacher of Imam ibn al-Qayyim, because when you read Madarij al-Salikin, you find Imam ibn Taymiyya everywhere. In other words, even though he's writing on this tradition of tasawwuf, for him, the greatest master of this path is Ibn Taymiyya, and usually he refers to his opinion on matters of dispute. So you find that Ibn Taymiyya, in fact, was extremely knowledgeable about tasawwuf, the entire tradition. He had written commentaries on the works of Abdul Qadir al-Jilani, the famous Hanbali Sufi of a couple of centuries earlier. And there is some possibility that he had been initiated into the Qadariyya tariqah in his younger age, although it seems that by his more mature career, Ibn Taymiyyah did not call himself a Sufi, but he had great love and respect for the early Sufis that he considered to be part of the Sunnah. And whenever he criticized Sufis, and he did broadly criticize Sufis, when I say broad number of the practices, he never criticized tasawwuf as a whole. In fact, he often offered excuses even for some of the practices of the Sufis or some of the Sufi groups that earlier people like Imam al-Ghazali would severely condemn. So for example, on the question of the shatahat, the ecstatic utterances of that some of the Sufis said while being in the state of this wajid or being
ecstasy
with they would say things that would be heretical, and Ibn Taymiyyah would say that if these people truly are overcome by ecstasy, then they are excused, whereas Imam al-Ghazali famously says in Ihya Ulumuddin that these people should be punished and executed, in fact, because they're saying kufr and they are responsible for it. So often there is a lot of misunderstanding about what this connection between now this Ibn al-Qayyim's book, Madarij al-Salikin, is a critical commentary. In other words, he does take Shaykh al-Islam Abu Ismail al-Harawi to account on a number of things, such as the denial of causality and preference for ecstatic knowledge over scriptural knowledge. There are a number of things which I write about in my articles that are available online. But on the whole, when he criticizes Abu Ismail al-Harawi, he always does so with utmost respect. That, he says in one place that his status is so much greater than our status, and his knowledge is so much greater, and his contribution to Islam, that if it were a matter of choice for us, we would not criticize him. But Shaykh, he says famously, Shaykh al-Islam habibun ilayna walakinna al-haqqa ilayna ahab, that Shaykh al-Islam beloved to us, but the only reason we critique is because the truth is more beloved to us. So this idea that Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn al-Qayyim condemned tasawwuf as a whole is incorrect, but they did critique.
I want to stop you there, and I'm going to move you from a place that I know you're very comfortable, talking about the classical tradition, and I'm going to bring you to offering some commentary, some social commentary on our community. So before even looking, and we will get an opportunity before this conversation ends to look at Madarij al-Salikin and your translation, but I want to probe and poke a little here. We have some very generic notions in our community that are very 21st century about what a traditional scholar is, what the traditional discourse is, who are the inheritors of the traditional, of the classic tradition, etc. And you find that many people who would place themselves under this, tent of neo-traditionalism, they see Ibn Taymiyyah, Ibn al-Qayyim al-Jawziyah, Ibn Jawzi, Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal in some very extreme cases. They see the Hanabila broadly as almost like the stepchildren of Sunni tradition. And you find that there is a certain valorization, to use a term that you used earlier, of the Malikiyya, the Shawafi'ah, the people of the Shafi'i madhab, and the Ahnaf, the people of the Hanafi school. And there's this kind of, holding at arm's length this other part of the tradition. You know, prolific writers, prolific authors that have written, you know, about many Islamic subjects. Why do you think that is? Why do you think that a lot of the people, and I don't want to name any names, but a lot of the people that connect to some of these contemporary exponents of traditional scholarship, you know, some of them, you know, I've spoken to them. They actually dislike Ibn Taymiyyah is something of he's seen as like the enemy of, you know, Sunnism. Ibn al-Qayyim, an enemy of Sunnism. Ibn Jawzi, an enemy of Sunnism. Al-Dhahabi, an enemy of Sunnism. Why do you think this is? Or number one, do you see that as well?
I think that, so yes, I think in part I agree with you. There is that tradition, particularly with Ibn Taymiyyah, with Ibn al-Qayyim is sometimes salvaged and sometimes not. Ibn al-Jawzi is seen as somebody who is less objectionable. Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal is seen as being in need of salvation from these associations. So I think that you're right, that there is that sense that some of these Hanabila are the stepchildren. Now, what's interesting is, you know, Fazl Rahman says in his book, Islam, I believe, that often it is these Ahl al-Hadith and the Hanabila were at the core of Sunni Islam, but their version of Islam, their commitment demanded so much that often they were activated only in times of crisis. At other times, people would rather live on the margins that were much more wider, that were much more open to adaptation. But you could, so anyway, this is one interpretation, and George Maqdisi also has something similar. And so my view is something close to that I think that what happens after Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn al-Qayyim and a number of other, this whole school, it finds itself in the 8th century, 7th and 8th centuries of Islam, in a place where they see Islam as being attacked both intellectually and besieged militarily, both by the Mongols and the Crusaders, and intellectually by the Tasawwuf of Ibn Arabi, which had, in their view, brought in the Neoplatonic tradition wholesale in an Islamic vocabulary on the one hand, and Avicennan tradition on the other hand. So you basically have the way, I know I'm sliding back into the territory that I like to talk.
Yes.
So let me come back. Ibn Taymiyyah then wrote as a fierce critic of these later developments in the classical period, starting in the 4th, 5th, and 6th centuries. And after Ibn Taymiyyah, over time, there is a reaction against him. Even in his time, as you know, famously, he died in prison, rahimahullah. And his disciple Ibn al-Qayyim was in prison with him and was released only after his death. And his writings were confiscated and so on. So there is a reaction against him. Despite that, you in fact find that many of his disciples and sometimes many of his opponents not only acknowledge just the great originality and power of his writings and teachings, and you find, in fact, surprisingly, that in India, in the Ottoman Empire, people are reading his writings often without attributing them to Ibn Taymiyyah because it becomes a dangerous name into the late medieval period. So the kind of neo-traditionalism that one sees today, first of all, there are many different kinds of traditionalism, right? Anybody who says I'm the only tradition is often selling you something. It's like, you know, Democratic kids who all say that the American people want this.
Sure.
American people that they're selling you something, but they are not true. Literally speaking, they aren't true. They may be talking about certain group of American people, right? And the same is true. Tradition says this, well, you know somebody's selling you something.
That's right. That's right.
So the kind of traditionalism that you're talking about is late Sunni traditionalism of the last, 17th, if you will, 17th and 18th centuries. And this kind of traditionalism came directly into contact, was directly challenged by the Salafiyya of Syria, Muhammad Abdu tradition, the reformist tradition, and in many places like Egypt, you already saw that this tradition transformed and became much richer because there are reformist ulama and then the traditionalist ulama going at each other, but also finding common ground. This did not happen in Syria and Mauritania or Yemen. These places are isolated from this. So partly what is happening is that people find the synthesis, the reformist tradition, the synthesis with the reformism and the Wahhabi movement that happened in the 20th century in Egypt and in more cosmopolitan places in South Asia and elsewhere. They find that to be a problem, partly because maybe they don't find their own whatever, they don't find room for it themselves. So basically people go to Syria, Mauritania, elsewhere. Now, of course, these are very general statements, but what people are trying to do when they're saying traditionalism, they are simply saying this tradition, not that tradition.
Yes, very important. One of the things that I think is interesting in an American context is how these different exponents of tradition become intertwined with certain notions of class and education, so that when we think of Salafis or Ahlul Hadith, the people of Hadith, and by Salafi I mean people that ascribe their practice to the practice of Islam, and particularly their theological orientation to the early Muslims. We tend to see them as poor, uneducated, in many instances Black, disenfranchised, backwards. And that exponent of Islam, because of our classist kind of outlook, that exponent of Islam is almost seen as being gutter. And then you have the Sufi, this is, for someone that has a historical perspective, this is really mind-blowing, because Sufism, in my kind of historical, admittedly impressionistic, broad historical reading, Sufism is almost always the beating religious heart of the poor, right? And you still see this when you travel the majority Muslim world. But in America, Sufism, with the retreats and the conferences and and these kind of very overt appeals to kind of like the culture of Andalus, and Sufism has like this very upper echelon, very sophisticated kind of presentation. So I think, and I'm not, and perhaps, I mean, and that's just, I would say that's just that's just a byproduct of historical circumstance, perhaps. But one of the things that I think is really cool, and this will be a great segue back into your translation, one of the things that I think is really cool about this book is seeing that, some of these have truths that we've been told, some of these very simple genealogies of knowledge that we've been given. Okay, these scholars good, these scholars spiritual, these scholars narrow-minded, mean-spirited, unspiritual. I think translating a work like Madarij as-Salikin can kind of upset that, can kind of, force people to think differently about what they've kind of inherited as truth about our tradition, its vastness, and who was writing about what, and who has been concerned about what. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I agree. In fact, this is one of the what might prompted me to start working on this book 20 years ago was because at that time the Sufi and Salafi fights were sort of very much found at every masjid, and it was American Muslim community right before 9/11, around that time, was in a different place, and so my intention was to change precisely that and to address these misunderstandings. But I want to go back to some of what you pointed out, that there is a class element to how these confrontations are often set up. So, for example, if you go to Egypt, the Salafis are those who live in the slums, right, in Cairo. Right, in Alexandria, they're a little more middle class, but in Cairo, and you are much more likely to have the Sufis. There could be by the way, two different kinds of Sufis. There are the Sufis who are from the villages who have almost no relationship to, and they couldn't even talk to each other if they wanted, to the upper class boys and girls who are going to these really hip sheikhs. They're completely different phenomena. The same is true in Pakistan, for example, and other places. And these are very much sociological phenomena, right? We impose religious meaning on this, but these are sociological phenomena. It does not mean that one is necessarily bad or good. It's simply that people find their expression in different things. And sometimes people's sometimes people's bigotry shows in how they judge these things, in the terms in which they judge these things. So and there is a very profound Orientalist influence in how Muslims have understood Islam, not for the last 20 years, but for the last 150 years. So that one of the reasons why Sufism is understood this way is because when more sophisticated, so when white people, essentially, the colonial class, some among them found attractive expression of their own need. Again, they're running away from the crass materialism that is rising in the West. So they go to the East looking for spirituality. They're not looking for God's message. They're not looking for what Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. What they're looking for is running away from materialism. So what they look for is not somebody who will tell them how to put your house in order and how to discipline your children and how to take care of it. They're looking for what to do when I am alone in my beautiful house and I have everything and I'm feeling lonely. I want to read. Now, go to African Americans. When African Americans find Sunni Islam, they're not looking for those things. They are looking for something that will get them, well, first of all, get them out of this sense of playing second fiddle to white Christians, and give them, if you will, they are much more intensely, God, tell us what to do, right? And we're not interested in various schools talking about different opinions. We want the thing, right? The real thing here and now. And often they're coming from Protestant background, so they want scripture. So they are gravitating toward Salafism. And so, you have these sociological phenomena still. And one of the reasons why we're seeing rise of Tasawwuf is not any kind of great spiritual or intellectual argument, but because after 9/11, American government decided that Sufism was good and Salafism was bad. And that's something that's gonna go away. And hopefully the playing field is going to be once again more level over time. But these imperial projects, of course, do have their effect. After 9/11, the Rand Corporation published this famous study called Civil Democratic Islam, where they in fact named people that are good Muslims and groups that are bad Muslims. And, you know, the Tablighis are somewhere here, the Yobandis are pretty close to bad. And upper class Muslims tend to gravitate toward mere spirituality, right? That kind of thing. And those people we can work with. So these were signals that Muslims read from the mainstream society and sort of rethought who they were. And you find this, phenomenon fairly. I mean,
I appreciate those insights.
There's a great sociological study by somebody. They simply looked at the titles of annual ISNA conferences, from like Justice for Mankind to basically taking over the world for Islam and brotherhood to care for the environment, or how can we become better American Muslims, to stuff like that. So
wow.
Just look at that, and it was quite remarkable, eye-opening for me. I mean, I know all of these things, but somebody put it that way. Like, well, you can almost plot the political events to the Muslim sort of self-expression in America. I mean, we live in the Golden Beast. It's not a surprise.
Sure. Wow. I've never heard it expressed, like the correlation expressed so clearly. Now, all of that being said, we're talking about kind of the tradition. We're talking about some of the contemporary, reality in terms of, how, our self-understanding. I want you to talk for a moment about why you think a book like this is important. Number one, in your, vocation as an academician, why this is important. Why is this book important? The book has been translated, but why you felt there was a need for another translation? And then secondly, for our community in this moment, what does the discourse of spiritual psychology or Islamic psychology, or I'm reluctant to use the term spirituality because it's such a loaded term, and I don't agree with the compartmentalization of life into the material, the spiritual. But why is a work like this, dealing with internal states, sincerity, the book is called Madarij as-Salikin, ranks of those journeying to God, ranks of those traveling to God, right? There are different levels, there are ranks. In this moment, where we are now, COVID, all kinds of human rights abuses taking place in the Muslim world, civil unrest in America, what might the relevance of a book like this be?
So subhanAllah, first of all, Muslims have never doubted that all good or all bad, all good and all evil starts from the heart, starts from the niyyah, it starts from what is within us. Both within us in terms of our connection to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and our connection to each other in our akhlaq. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يُغَيِّرُ مَا بِقَوْمٍ حَتَّى يُغَيِّرُ مَا بِأَنفُسِهِمْ. And so Allah will not change the state of a people, the condition of a people, unless they change what is within them, and by which we can understand two things: what is within them, that is within their souls, and also what is within them, as in what is between them. In other words, how they treat each other. And both of these things, our inner states, this is the font of anything that comes outside ultimately. So there are books of fiqh and books of siyasa and other things that I work on, that
books of fiqh, meaning books of law, books of politics, books
right,
of
exactly. that all have a season. There is a place and time for that, but there is the kind of discourse that is always relevant for each one of us all the time, and that is our relationship to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that's the most important thing. Our ihsan, the beautification of our relationship to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, so that when we worship Allah, we don't do it merely as a wrapper, but rather we bring within our heart substance that is beautiful as a gift that we are presenting, or rather as a presentation to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The reason I chose, rather than writing an original work, is first of all, Madarij al-Salikin is really a commentary, Quranic commentary on. When I say Quranic commentary, it takes the traditions of the first 6 centuries and brings them all together and subjects them, if you will, to Quranic analysis. And this is why it is such an invaluable work, because what Ibn al-Qayyim intended to do was to refound some aspects of tasawwuf, that is, re-establish the aspects of tasawwuf that he believed had been established on shaky foundations or had been misunderstood or misconstrued. So it is Quranic tasawwuf, you could say. Like the purpose of writing this book was to take all of these different traditions for the first 5 or 6 centuries until his time, and look at whether you can find and what kind of Quranic and Sunnaic foundation can you find. And it's the other thing that is a great merit of the text, that it's a very generous text, interpretively, hermeneutically. It is a very charitable text. So it tries to find the best possible interpretation of sometimes things that even a typical Shara'i Sufi, mainstream Sufi today would say, well, that's just not good, not okay. You'll find Ibn al-Qayyim spending pages after pages of maybe this is what he meant, maybe that is what he meant, right? An example of that is, and he follows Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyya in this, where Ibn Taymiyya says about Hajj, no less, Al-Hallaj, the famous Sufi who, or rather, I mean, it's complicated, but famous mystic who said that Ana al-Haq, I am God and I am the truth and so on, and was executed under complex conditions where we don't know exactly why he was executed. But anyway, Hallaj the martyr then became the symbol. What's interesting is that Hallaj was repudiated by the Sufis of Baghdad. So
yeah, Junaid actually petitioned him to recant his statement, and he would not.
Yes, and then Junaid had died at the time, and his Khalifa Jarir, in fact, signed if he was signed on the fatwa for his execution according to tradition. So he was not part of that group. The only people who actually protested his execution were the Hanbalis of Baghdad. That's the odd thing.
Wow.
But we can't get into that history. But my point is that Ibn Taymiyya said that even though the works, the statements that he is making are kufr, but if he said them in the state of intoxication, then he may be excused. He's not saying he is, but rather it's a conditional statement that we don't know the end result of these things, because one could say kufr, statements of kufr, because of one's inner weakness. In other words, sometimes we say these things because we are psychologically overwhelmed by the experience. And unlike the Sahaba and the Prophet, who are strong enough as believers and as men to have their both ilm and ma'rifah together and subjugate, if you
by ilm you mean knowledge, and by ma'rifah you mean experiential knowledge.
Exactly. Very good. Jazakallah khair. So this distinction of ilm and ma'rifah, of course, a later product, But by this time, this was made. In the Quran, there is no such distinction. So what Ibn Taymiyya says, and then Ibn al-Qayyim follows with this line of thought and then develops it much further, is that sometimes people are psychologically weak or perhaps conceptually weak. And so they interpret their experiences, which may be truly devout experiences, right? And one should not belittle those devout experiences of spiritual hal with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In fact, we only wish we had more of them. But once you have them, you may very easily be fooled by them if you do not have the proper knowledge or the proper strength of iman and character. And so you may think that Allah directly spoke to you and may say something that goes against the Sharia of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And there were many people who in fact were saying precisely that. People would say, the famous Sufi saying among some Sufi circles was that those whom Allah considers unworthy of our knowledge, our ma'rifah, He busies them with the knowledge of the scripture. So it's Quran and Sunnah. So basically, this is the cover, and we are the real thing. So this is Sharia versus Haqiqah. And in Madarij al-Salikin's basic purpose was to say, no, Sharia is the Haqiqah. This separation is impossible. That in fact, the foundation of ma'rifah is the Quran, just as the foundation of ilm is the Quran.
No, it's very, now my last thing, because we're running out of time, and I know I'm going to get scolded later because this conversation, I think some might perceive it as a little bit recondite, by which I mean you have to have some background knowledge before you can, really appreciate some of the exchange. But in our effort at ALIM to, demonstrate great respect for our students, we want to expose them to, a considerable level of discourse. So I make no apologies about the fact that you are a scholar and you speak like a scholar. However, closing out on a note that I hope will maybe answer some questions and address some practical concerns for people that might be listening. What do you say to people who say Madarij al-Salikin is another instance of a do-it-yourself kind of tazkiyah, when what we really need in this moment spiritually is we need people. We need to pledge our apprenticeship, our allegiance to people that can take us by the hand and help us to, purify our souls and rectify our inward conditions. And that for them is found in kind of institutional tariqah tasawwuf, right? Whereas this seems like a kind of do-it-yourself manual, and that is in and of itself something that is inherently flawed. Number one, would you agree with that characterization? Number two, do you feel that approach is inherently flawed?
The short answer is no, I do not agree with this. SubhanAllah, there is nothing in our tradition that would suggest that this is an either-or problem. That in fact, in my view, sociality, being part of a group of people, brothers and sisters, including a possibility of tariqah, is a great blessing if you can find one. But even while you're in it, there are two needs. For your murshid, whoever is directing you to know this stuff, and they will benefit from the book, and for you to know and to hold your murshid accountable. Because one thing we certainly do not have in Islam is someone holding the key to your salvation and telling you, in other words, this very book, among other books, can be the means by which you belong to and what you work through in your circle of brothers and sisters and your murshid, your spiritual director, if you're fortunate enough and blessed enough to have one. Vast majority of Muslims don't have that, and I wish we could move toward communities where we have more such people. But the idea of charlatans, of corrupt spiritual directors, is very common, not only now, right? Sheikh in sheep's clothing, all that stuff, but in fact, it's throughout history, it's well known. It's not a new problem, because whenever human beings are given power, especially the kind of power that a spiritual director has, there is a possibility of corruption, there is an abuse. So you have to have that foundation of knowledge yourself. Just because you read the book, and it's 1,000 pages of him, so I'm not going to say that it's something that you can read, and it's something that you will live with rather than a book that you can read in it or two. But even if you're able to, if you read it, you're going to need a sheikh or more than one sheikhs. Preferably, I insist that have more than one sheikhs. To help you go through this, right? To rise in those ranks with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So I don't see that as a zero-sum game, right? To me, the both are very important. You have that knowledge yourself systematically, and if you are fortunate enough to have access to a sheikh, a teacher, a mentor, a big brother, big sister, use them all, man. And brothers and sisters, we have that this property that Allah has to offer, this Jannah, is very expensive. And you're not going to get to it easy. So the Rasulullah says that that if you want to succeed, he uses the word adlaj, which means leave very early morning before Fajr. So the image here that you have the caravan, and if you want to get to your destination before the sun gets too hot, you have to leave very early, get up at night. And it is that kind of situation that we are in. This dunya is short, it is deceptive. Its powers of deception are enormous and multiplying, and our tawakkul and our reliance is on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone, and those who bring us to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the brotherhood and sisterhood in Islam, the love for the sake of Allah that you have for your shuyukh and your parents and those who correct you. This is part of what will bring you. There is no, but one final thing I will say, there is no shortcut to Jannah except one. If there is one shortcut that comes, one thing that comes close to shortcut to Jannah in Islam, and that is the brotherhood and sisterhood for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because once you are in the company of people who are doing righteous things, then for you to do so becomes part of a pleasure, part of your happiness, right? You do it naturally. And that is a shortcut to Jannah. If you can find yourself in that company, you're blessed, and become that company for other people. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen.
Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen wa khitamuhu misk. You know, it's sealed with misk. You know, I was actually going to ask you to give a concluding thought, but I don't think you could have ended any more powerfully, you know, than you just ended. I do want to thank you for coming on. I hope that this book that you've translated is something that every Muslim family lives with, regardless of their position on tasawwuf or Sufism, or I hope it becomes, required reading, for young Muslims, just so that we can turn toward that interiorized discourse, because our tradition is rich, with that. And if anything will vindicate Islam, in this time, of course, Allah Ta'ala says, أرسل هو الذي أرسل رسوله بالهدى ودين الحق ليظهره على دين كله. It is God that sent his messenger with guidance and the religion of truth to make it prevail over all other ways of life. And it would be, a truncation of that verse to look at that only in socio-political terms or militaristic terms. This religion prevailing is in it being able to produce the kinds of human beings that nothing else can produce. And, we owe it to the guidance that God has given us to live lives that are testaments to what this tradition is all about. I think that this text, and hopefully your translation of this text, is a book that will help us toward that purpose. God willing. Ovamir, I thank you. Please send my best to everyone in Toledo, your children, your family. Once all of this is over, I look forward to sharing some presents with you, God willing.
Inshallah, we'll look forward to that. Allah bless you.
Inshallah.
And all of
Ameen,
you.
ameen, ya
Thank you
Rabbal
for-
Alameen. Ameen, ameen, ya Rabb. Ameen, ya Rabbal Alameen. Inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.